want to I do want to really dive into this in more detail. So first of all, and again, one of the themes that I think you're hearing over and over again is that data and AI roles are not going away, but the challenges being addressed are changing, and they will continue to change. They're getting more niche. They're getting more a niche from a technical perspective, I should say. At the same time, companies are struggling with things like productization, uh, culture, showing business value, things that are really quote unquote soft in nature. And so the roles that you're applying for, how you'll be thinking about these roles in the coming 6 to 12 months and longer, of course, will be changing. And so you wanna strategize around that. So when it comes to technical roles, the important thing is that there are more options coming up and there is more nuance in the roles themselves. Again, 10 years ago, you could have been applying for AI roles. That when I was starting my career in the AI space 15 years ago, it was literally like AI and machine learning was what we were doing. We didn't distinguish between subfields. We didn't distinguish between methodologies that much. Then things started breaking out. We had experts in NLP, we had experts in computer vision, in ML engineering or ML ops. And this was true even 1 to 2 years ago. What we're seeing now is the roles are getting more nuanced. There's just to use NLP as the example, there's research scientists, there's NLP engineers, then there's field specific engineering like large language model engineers or privacy engineers that are very unique to NLP as a subfield of AI. Prompt engineering is another good example that's applicable to both NLP and I would say computer vision. So as you think about your career and as you think about your career trajectory, ask yourself, what are some of these really specific fields that you could emphasize and that you could really focus on and use to stand out, or maybe to apply for in some ways. To show you a few examples of what I mean, because so far I've been very theoretical, here are a few of these job postings that we've seen literally in the last few months that are coming up as a result. Prompt engineer and librarian at Anthropic. So Anthropic is builds large language models similar to OpenAI. They are literally looking for people who are very comfortable and good at interacting with prompts and large language models to test their capabilities in some way. The librarian side of things is really interesting as well, because more and more companies are also concerned about tracking the data sets that they are using, understanding the data lineage, how is data changing over time, both for regulatory purposes, for training purposes, and for other purposes altogether. So here's a really interesting job posting that you might want to explore to see how things are changing. Another example is Cohere, software engineer for model serving. So again, as we do more large models and foundation models that take hundreds of milliseconds to run, or in some cases multiple seconds to run, and there's so much demand for them, ML engineering, specifically within the context of foundation models and large language models and computer vision, are becoming more and more relevant. And finding people who are good at that specific thing is really, really difficult. So that's another example of a more technical role that you could consider or think about. Now, one of the questions that did come up is advice on how to complete projects end to end. What I would recommend within this context specifically is actually building projects where you provide an example of the problem you're solving. So maybe in this case, it's how do you actually streamline or build an API that, in a performant way serves a large language model. You could do that by downloading a copy of a large language model on Hugging Face, documenting what you're doing, discussing the architecture, but then actually building the code and then publishing it to GitHub, let's say. And then you've got an end-to-end project that's very specific, but right off the bat tells me so much about what you're capable of and also some of the research that you're interested in. The other thing that's really important here is soft skills. They are really, really, really hard to hire for. And it's also challenging because a lot of the technical skills, when people are good at the technical details, sometimes they struggle on the soft side. So finding people who are capable of both is difficult. Finding people who are good on the soft side of things, but are aware of AI research and aware of how models work is also extremely difficult. And so again, I want to show a few examples of job postings here, but then I'll talk about some of the trends. So expert solution architect, right? Solution architecture is a great example of a space where you need to understand the technology, but you ultimately also need to understand the business problems and map the technology to address the business problems. That mapping exercise requires a lot of communication, a lot of consulting, stakeholder management. It's really, really hard to do. And again, it's hard to hire for because those two skill sets, right? Collecting business requirements and dealing with stakeholders is so difficult, in addition to finding people who are also comfortable with understanding how far a technology can be pushed. Another example from Cohere, a senior product manager, foundation models. Product management in AI right now is a really interesting space that I think will only get more interesting over time. The reason it's so difficult to hire for, and why I think so many people who are good AI product managers, why they're in such high demand, is because, again, you need to understand what's difficult, what's possible, what's easy for AI models to do, but then you have to convert that to user requirements. You have to convert that to actually solving a problem that a user or customer might have, and that is really, really difficult. And by the way, the product manager one comes up a lot. Vector's hiring for that. Bench size hiring for that. Consulting firms are hiring for that. So again, it's one of these things where if this could be your niche, right? Product management plus AI, and it's a really, really exciting one. Now, what I do want to talk about briefly here is when I mention things like AI product management, people sometimes ask, like, I know what product management is, I know what AI is. How the heck do you actually combine them? What are some of the day-to-day questions someone like this might be asking? And these are questions that come up across the board with all of these different roles, but I want to call out product management specifically. So a product manager in the space might be asking questions like, can we even build a model to address the user need? Specifically, like, is this thing that we want to automate or streamline for the user something that we can model with data? What kind of data do we need to collect in the first place? If we are building models or putting them in production, how do we communicate with users? If there's an error, if the model makes a mistake, if the model needs to provide feedback, is the model explainable? Certain users need to have explainable models, and they can't actually use deep neural networks that are too convoluted or act like black boxes. What is the cost of error? If a model is doing well, but sometimes make a mistake, what does it mean to make a mistake? And I'll give you an example here that maybe is quite stark, but with things like autonomous vehicles, there's a really interesting question around the cost of an error, both from a regulatory perspective, but also, like, let's get down into the nitty gritty of a model. What is a false positive or a false negative? If, let's say, I'm building a model to detect objects in the way of a car, a false positive isn't so bad, right? Because if a car thinks that there's something in front of it and it stops or swerves, I mean, it's not ideal, but it's not so bad. A false negative, where the car doesn't see the object in front of it, or the model doesn't detect the object in front of it and the car drives into it, that's a significant error, right? So knowing the distinction between a false positive and a false negative, understanding how model requirements translate into user requirements and also translate into the research your company might be doing is so difficult. And this is an example in product management, but this is true in consulting, in AI transformations, sales as well. Another example is how big is the data set that we need to build? There's a great blog post here that you can see later on the economics of data products. And one of the things that the author Abraham talks about is the difficulty of building what he calls a minimum viable corpus. We hear about minimum viable product all the time, and minimum viable corpus is building a data set that's big enough to actually train a model on, right? That's not a trivial problem. Like, how do you start? Where do you start? And so these are the sorts of questions an AI product manager might be asking. And you can see how understanding how models work is important, but it's not enough to be technical. You need to know the user requirements, product requirements, business requirements, and the economics of the product you're working on, which is why it's so hard to hire for these roles and why there's so much excitement around them as well. So some of the roles that are coming up that you might want to be aware of or following, product management, of course, I talked about this already. User experience as a maybe subset or certainly in relation to product management. Some of the questions I mentioned earlier, how do you communicate model errors? Do models need to be explainable? How do you explain the model? Is it with a visualization? Is it with a beep, a noise? Is it something else? These are all really important user experience questions and design questions that we simply don't even have best practices for today. Sales and marketing, particularly go-to-market. What I mean by go-to-market is sales and marketing roles that require you to take a product that's never been sold before. This tends to be particularly difficult because account executives or marketers within this context don't have marketing materials yet. They might not know if the thing they're selling actually is necessary for users. They don't know what are the best channels. And so again, you need to really understand user needs here. You need to be good at sales, but you need to also know what's possible from a modeling and AI perspective, or certainly from a product perspective. And finding people who are comfortable with this uncertainty, with this technology is, again, really, really hard to find. Finally, what I will also bring up here is around solution engineering. So solution engineering as a potential a capability for you. Solution engineers I already talked about a little bit. The idea behind this isn't so much around taking a product to market, but around solving a problem for a user or a customer with the technologies that have already been built. So how do you architect the solution? How do you understand the customer's needs and map them back to the product? And you can see across, this is just understanding AI in different ways, or understanding the product in different ways. And finally, digital transformations or AI transformations. What I mean by AI transformations here is, again, it's a type of consulting. It's, a lot of businesses are excited to change their operations and how they work today. And they want to use AI to do that, but then they actually hit a wall. They build these interesting models and no one wants to use them. And so these consultants, digital transformation or AI transformation consultants, have to ask questions like, do the models work? Do they work well enough? Are they consistent enough? Or do employees not trust or use these insights because the models don't work? Or maybe the data wasn't correct in the first place. Maybe employees weren't involved in the process of building these models, so they'll never use them. If we do create new processes where we take an old manual task and automate it via AI, how do we know if it's working? How do we know if it's working well enough? These are questions that consultants need to answer. And at the same time, again, they need to know the AI components. They need to be comfortable with the modeling process and the challenges of the modeling process, but they need to be then also comfortable with culture change, with process management, stakeholder management, communication, etc. So this is what I mean by some of these really difficult technical, non-technical roles that are so incredibly important to hire for, and at the same time difficult to hire for. And I think they will only become more and more popular, certainly in the next 12 months, if not the next decade. Now, the last thing I want to mention, and we have had webinars on this before, but it's also come up within a few questions here, is hybrid data scientists. So when I say hybrid data scientist, what I mean is a subject matter expert that also happens to be a data scientist. Everything I've talked about so far has been in the abstract, right? You could be a product manager with AI capabilities in pretty much in any field. With regards to this type of data scientist, what I'm specifically thinking about is people who have one foot in a subject area that is difficult to learn about, and they're also good at some form of data science or AI. So you might be, let's say, you were an account manager at a financial services firm, and then you pivoted into data science. So you know how financial products work, but you also know data science. That makes you really unique and special for financial services firms. We see a lot of biotechnology folks, whether it's people with undergraduate degrees in biology or people who have spent a few years working in industry, also pick up AI skills. Again, what's really, really exciting is this combination, because if you're a biotech company, like let's say BenchSci, one of the companies we were showing their job postings for, finding people who can do both of those things is really hard. And ideally, that's who you want. You don't want someone who does one really well, but not the other. You want someone who can do both generally pretty well. So if you are someone that has some of these underlying skill sets that, again, maybe it's a career pivot, maybe it's just a different set of jobs that you've done in the past, emphasize that and show how that makes you really, really unique. It is such a valuable set of combinations. If you're struggling with this, by the way, I do find when we do our one-on-one sessions with the Vector Institute, a lot of feedback people get is to remove some of these kind of like irrelevant roles when they get advice from guidance counselors or other places. So my advice is the exact opposite. Emphasize it, wear it proudly, and show tell that story to the recruiter, the hiring manager, on why those skill sets are so valuable and so important for your specific role or your specific career path.